Hi, I'm Craig Damlow from Soapbox Rocket. I'm an innovation coach that helps companies define their innovation strategy, define their customers, and execute on their innovation projects. This is my second video for Founders Live Influencer Series, Understanding Your Customer. Today I want to talk about designing for the edges. And I want to talk about identifying your customer edge cases and why designing for them is such an important thing you can do in your product development. Before I go there, I want to read a quote from Chip Heath in his book Made to Stick. Chip said, "People who design products are experts cursed by their knowledge, and they can't imagine what it's like to be as ignorant as the rest of us." Now, this isn't directly to edge cases, but I think it's an important quote to think about. And when you're thinking about who your average customer is and who your edges are, think about the fact that they don't know everything you know about your product. They haven't sat with it as long as you have, and they're not experts like you are. So it's important to get out and see customers using your product in their environment on how they're using it, not necessarily how you intended. So this is a customer curve. This is the customer adoption cycle. And it's probably fairly familiar. This is probably the version that's a lot more familiar, with the chasm here between your early adopters and your early majority. And this is the innovator's dilemma, right? How do I build a product and then move from early adopters to early majority? And you can see your edges here. You have your innovators on the front end and your laggards on the back end. This is an important customer curve, but it's not the one I want to talk about today. This is used a lot, so I just wanted to show it and talk about it a little bit. So this is not your average user. This is just where they started using your product. So if you develop for an innovator, you're developing for people that just want to try new things, and they're not necessarily your average customer. They still could be. Same thing with the laggards. They're at the end. They're an edge case of adoption, but not necessarily an edge case of your customer. So this is the curve I want to talk about. When we talk about edge cases, this is the curve. This is your standard bell curve for a customer. Right in the middle is your average customer. There is no perfect average customer, but if you had one, at least if you had one defined, this is where they sit. And then you've got your outside edges out there. You've got 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma as it goes down. Those are the edges we want to talk about here on the right and the left. Now, traditionally, if we're going to develop a product, we're going to define it and develop it for our average customer because it will give us 68% market share, or it will at least work for 68% of our market. And that's a great market share. That's 2/3. If you could capture that, that would be great. But if you do capture 2/3, the first thing that people are going to ask you, how do you get more? And that's where the problem comes in. If you've designed it for your average, it really does work for 68% of your market, or at least it works well enough. Now, once you start getting outside of that, you start to get into this area where it might not work as well. And so you start to do product changes. You have to start adding feature. You have to change it. So the better process is to design for your edges first. Those are your novices and your power users. Now the first reaction you're going to have is, okay, that's only 32%. That's a third of my customer segment. Before I was designing for 2/3, now you're telling me to design for a third? Yes and no. I want you to design for the edges, but the key here is that if you develop for the edges, it'll work also for your average. It'll work for that middle, so it's 68% plus the edges you've designed for, or at least are able to include. It also means you don't have to redevelop to capture 80% of the market. You develop for the 80 up front, and you're going to be able to get it. Now, this is a really conceptual what I've talked about so far, hard to grasp. I think the best way to go to talk further about it is to just go through examples. At least that's the best way that I think to understand, is to go through these examples. The first one is the potato peeler and OXO company. The traditional potato peeler worked for 68% of the market. It was almost perfect for 68% of the market because it was cheap, because it was simple stamped metal, it was easy to produce, so which made it cheap, and most people could grab it and just go ahead and peel potatoes. Now, the founder of OXO, Sam Farber, was watching his wife struggle with a traditional potato peeler one day because she had arthritis and she wasn't able to get a full grip on the potato peeler. Now, for most of us, that wasn't a problem. You still have the problem of if it's wet, but we deal with it for the cost savings. So what Sam did is he went and he partnered with Smart Design in New York City. Smart Design was sharing studio space with a gerontologist, Patricia Moore. Gerontologist is someone who studies the elderly. And she helped them come up with the design you see today and really the OXO brand image. And that's the rubber handle with the little ridges on it. Their first prototype was actually the traditional peeler glued into a BMX bike handle, and you can kind of see that's where the ridges were carried over for. Now, this was designed specifically for Sam's wife, or at least is specifically for someone with arthritis that has a hard time gripping. The thing is, this is now the new standard on peelers because it worked better for the average as well. So that's one of the reasons you want to know your edges and design for them, because if you can design for an edge, in this case a lagging edge, trailing edge, sorry, then it works for your average, and it's also going to work for your power users. If you're someone working in a kitchen and having to peel 100 potatoes, this one's going to work better because it's not going to require as much strength and you'll be able to do more potatoes. So again, designed for the edges but works better for the middle. Now that's, like I said, that's the trailing edge. What about the leading edge? What about an example of a power user? Chris Messina, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is the Twitter user that invented the hashtag, or as he called it, the pound. Here's his tweet. He said, "How do you feel about using pound for groups, as in pound bar camp, or now we say hashtag bar camp?" And this was in 2007. There were no simple ways of searching threads in Twitter, and this was his solution. As a power user, he wanted to be able to follow a conversation amongst a whole bunch of people, not just the people he was following. So he recommended the hashtag, and obviously it worked. Facebook has adopted them. We get it in popular culture, and that's a perfect example of a power user and a company listening to the power user. Now, ideally, Twitter would have been able to go and observe somebody using the hashtag, but it does require somebody to start, somebody to suggest it to even get to that point. So again, designed for a power user, but it works, it helps the average, and it works for the trailing edge too, because if you're new to Twitter, it's something that's easily identifiable, especially with pop culture references, and clickable to see messages around whatever that hashtag is. In Chris's case, it was Barcamp. For Founders Live, it's Founders Live. So, great examples, a nice trailing edge, a nice leading edge, and how they work better. But I think we learn more from failures. We definitely learn more from our own failures, but I think we can also learn from others' failure as well. And hopefully this example here will help you learn more. Now, if you ask most people, what was the first computer with a graphical user interface and a mouse, they're going to say the Apple. It was the Apple Lisa. introduced, but that's not actually true. About a year before Apple released the Lisa, Xerox released the Xerox Spark, and it had a graphical user interface, it had a mouse, it had an Ethernet port, and it even had a what you see is what you get word processor. Way ahead of its time. But what happened is Xerox developed it and marketed it to the middle of the market. In 1981, when they released the Star, it cost $16,500, which ended up being about $6,000 more than the Apple Lisa when it came out a year later. But it wasn't a standalone computer. It was not a personal computer. Xerox was marketing it towards companies who were still running mainframes. So you had a central file server, you had a central print server, and you had multiple computers that you could share these features with. Way ahead of its time. Even the Lisa didn't go as far as what you see is what you get word processor or Ethernet. But it had the mouse and it had the GUI. Failed miserably because it only worked for that fat middle. At $16,500, the average secretary salary at the day was $12,000. So you're looking at an investment of 3 or 4 of these machines that cost more than it costs to hire a secretary for a year. Now, Apple wasn't much better at $10,000, but it was a personal computer. That was the edge case when Apple developed the Lisa and later the Macintosh. And they even said when they introduced the Macintosh, for the rest of us, because they were the edge case. They were the power users and of the time. People at home that had a computer at home. Not everybody had a computer at home. Very few people did. They developed it for those individuals, and it worked. It worked so well, it also worked in the office. You didn't necessarily need the mainframe computers. You could get everything done. On top of Apple taking the GUI and mouse from Xerox and developing it into the first personal computer, Microsoft ended up taking the what you see is what you get word processor by acquisition of talent. The person that developed it for Xerox, she went to work for Microsoft and developed Microsoft Word 3.0, which was the first what you see is what you get word processor, which is really what we all use today. So this was kind of a both side. This was fantastic failure in that Xerox designed for the average, they designed for the middle, and Apple took the same technology and designed for the edges. And Apple won out. Xerox did release a PC version of the Star a year later, but it absolutely, at that point, was too late. And that's one of the reasons it's important for you to design for your edges. If you let somebody else design for your edges, they're going to steal your averages as well. So what you need to do is figure out who's in your middle. Who is your average user? Then go to the edges and say, okay, if my average customer is using my product 3 times a week, then go out and say, okay, what are my extremes? Go out and interview customers and find out and say, wow, this person's using it 3 times a day. And then you find someone else, well, I'm only using it every other week. Well, find out why. What are they using it for that they still have the product and are using it, but they're clearly on the trailing edge, and someone using it 3 times a day would be on your leading edge. It's important to understand who your average is, but again, you cannot just create an average. You actually have to measure that entire bell curve to define the average, and then design for your edge cases to improve your average person's use. So that's it for today. Those are your edges. I hope you can make use of this. If you're watching this when we first release it through Founders Live, I'll be doing a live Q&A on Founders Live website. If not, you can find me at soapboxrocket.com or on Twitter at soapboxrocket, and let me know if you have any further questions, and I will try and answer all of them as best I can. Thanks.